The wind on Garad 3 never stopped. It carried the sound of 1,000 rusted things groaning under the weight of time. Wind whistled through the hollowed bellies of dead ships, shrieked past towers of tangled wiring, and stirred the soot that coated every surface in a choking metallic dust. Oscar stepped out of his ship and into that breathless desolation, boots crunching over broken circuitry and scattered bolts. The air was sour with oxidized iron and burned coolant. The sky, dim and sickly orange, hung low above mountains of mechanical wreckage, stacked so high they blotted out the sun. Somewhere out there, the twin moons would rise later, dragging their pale light across a world forgotten by the stars. He adjusted the strap of his satchel and tapped the console on his wrist. No signals, no activity. Perfect. Garad 3 had once been a supply node during the Third Interstellar Conflict. Now it was nothing more than a graveyard, an endless field of discarded machines and forgotten wars. Whole civilizations' leftovers rotted here, and Oscar, like many others who'd run out of places to belong, had come to pick through the corpses of progress. He didn't plan to stay long. And yet, not 10 minutes into his survey, he heard something. A sound that didn't belong in a dead place. A voice. Thin, high, innocent. Faster than the sky wind, it whispered. Oscar stopped. Instinct kicked in. Half caution, half curiosity. His hand hovered near the stun pistol holstered beneath his coat. Slowly, he moved toward the sound, weaving through shattered drone wings and gutted freight pods. There, between a collapsed shuttle frame and the skeletal remains of a mining walker, he saw her. A child. She was crawling through the dirt. No, dragging herself. She had no legs, only rounded stumps wrapped in thin layers of cloth and old foam, so worn through they offered no protection. Her knees were bleeding, scraped raw from the rough terrain. Dried blood clung to her skin in a pattern that told a long story of this not being the first time. But she was smiling, skin a soft, iridescent blue, faintly luminescent under the hazy light. Her hair, short, white, and uneven, was chopped into a straight bob that framed her face like a halo of snow. Large silver eyes sparkled as she moved, as if this was play, as if this pain was normal. Oscar felt his stomach twist. She was mumbling to herself between gritted teeth. One day, I'll run. Not hop, not crawl, run fast. Like the sky wind. He stood frozen, 1 foot forward, uncertain whether to speak or just vanish before someone took him for a threat. Then she slipped, one arm catching on a jagged bit of old alloy. She gasped as her body dropped forward, and a sharp, wet scrape echoed as her already scarred knees dragged across a strip of metal. Damn, Oscar breathed, instinct pulling him toward her. But before he could take a full step, a shadow moved like lightning. A figure descended between them, tall, broad-shouldered, radiating hostility. The woman crouched beside the girl and swept her into her arms in one fluid motion. Her expression was carved from stone. She had the same luminous blue skin as the child, but her hair was long, tied back with loops of copper and bits of salvaged metal that clicked faintly when she moved. Her face was older, sharper, beautiful, but fierce. A warrior forged by starvation and fire. She looked up at Oscar, eyes burning yellow-green. "Back away," she said coldly. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," Oscar said, lifting his hands slowly, palms out. "I just saw her fall." "She doesn't fall," the woman snapped. "She moves. That's all she knows how to do." Oscar swallowed. His eyes flicked down to the girl, now nestled against her mother's chest, whispering something too soft to catch. "I've got medical patches," he offered carefully. "That cut on her leg. We don't need your help." The tone left no room for argument. Oscar took a step back, but didn't leave. Not yet. He looked at the girl again. Her name hadn't been spoken aloud, but he already knew she wasn't like most kids. There was too much silence in her, too much determination in her mangled crawl, and too much joy in a world that offered none. "I'm not offering help," he said after a pause. "Just a strip. She's bleeding." The woman said nothing for a long moment. Then finally she nodded, barely. Oscar approached slowly, kneeling to pull out the patch from his kit. When he got close, the little girl peeked out from her mother's arms. "You smell funny," she said. Oscar smiled. "That's what happens when you work with dead tech and old grease for too long." "What's your name?" she asked, tilting her head. "Oscar." "I'm Zara." Her grin widened, revealing tiny, sharp teeth. "You don't look like the others." "What others?" he asked, gently applying the patch to her leg. The ones that come here, they take parts. They don't talk. They don't look. They never see me. Oscar met her eyes. Well, I see you. Her grin turned softer, more uncertain. Mama says people who look too long usually want something. I don't, he said. And that was true, though he didn't know why. The woman, Mira, he assumed, finally spoke. You've done enough. Leave. Her voice wasn't cruel, but there was something brittle underneath, like someone who had trusted before and paid for it with blood. Oscar nodded, rising without protest. He looked once more at Zara, whose tiny fingers now clung to a bent piece of tubing she was pretending was a wand. She waved it at him. Fixerman, she whispered like a spell. Come back. He turned without a word and walked away, back toward the ridge. He should have kept going. His plan was simple. Locate intact reactor cells, strip them, leave. No risk, no mess. No one else's tragedy to carry on his shoulders. He'd spent the last 6 years running from that exact weight. But as he passed an old, rust-covered sign half buried in the soil, Sector 9, Biotech Disposal Zone, he paused. Something old flickered in his mind. A face, a laugh, a girl who had once called him daddy before fire took her, and everything else. Oscar shook his head hard, like he could physically shove the thought away. He descended back into the wreckage, grabbed what parts he could, and filled his pack with quiet efficiency. He didn't look back at the shelter, or the woman who watched him leave with haunted eyes, or the child who called him Fixerman like a hero in a story. But when the stars crept out and the cold began to settle in the junk, Oscar found himself back in the same alley of twisted metal. He stood there in the dark with a bundle of salvaged servo joints, stripped wiring, and a power core the size of a melon. He wasn't sure why. He just knew that girl deserved more than bleeding knees and empty dreams. And maybe, just maybe, he needed to give something, anything, that wasn't meant to be thrown away. Tomorrow he'd start building, a way for her to stand, a way for her to run. Oscar returned at dawn, before the sky had shifted from bruised violet to its usual dull orange. The world of Garrett 3 was silent except for the whisper of metal in the wind, the occasional groan of shifting scrap heaps, and the static crackle that always haunted the edges of the old battlefield zones. He carried a small satchel, bulging with wires, stripped servos, an ancient joint module that barely passed a diagnostic scan, and a thin fusion coil he'd repaired late into the night. They weren't much, but they were a beginning. He approached the shelter carefully, his boots crunching softly over a trail of crushed screws and dusty footprints. He could already feel her eyes on him. Mira didn't trust easily, and he hadn't expected anything different. She was standing outside the lean-to, arms crossed, the wind pulling gently at her long white hair. Her posture was as solid as it was wary, like someone constantly calculating whether to flee or fight. Her sharp gaze met his without flinching, but she didn't move to stop him. Zara sat near the entrance on a flattened sheet of metal, legs folded beneath her as best they could, humming softly while stacking rusted bolts in a crooked little tower. Her scraped knees were newly bandaged with the patch he'd left yesterday, though the wrappings were already stained dark from fresh movement. When she saw him, her entire face lit up. "Fixerman!" she called, scattering the bolts as she waved. Oscar smiled despite himself. "Told you I'd be back." Mira's voice came sharp from the side. "You didn't say anything. You just walked away." He met her eyes, then nodded once. "Fair." He set down the satchel without stepping closer, careful not to overstep whatever invisible line Mira had drawn between them. "I brought parts," he said. "It's not much, but I've got a few servos that might handle basic load bearing. I can rig a simple lower limb frame. She wouldn't be able to stand long yet, but it's a start." Mira didn't respond right away. Her expression was hard, but not unreadable. There was a tremor there, a shadow of uncertainty flickering behind her tightly controlled stare. "And what do you want for them?" she asked at last. Oscar raised an eyebrow. "Nothing." "That's never true." "It is this time." She studied him, clearly not satisfied with that answer. But Zara had already scrambled to the satchel, her small hands diving into it like it was treasure. She pulled out a servo with a triumphant grin and held it to the light. "Will this make me fly?" she asked. Oscar crouched beside her. "Not yet, but maybe someday," she giggled, placing the part against her thigh like it might attach itself by magic. "I want to run first. Then maybe I'll fly." Mira stepped forward. Zara, be careful with that. It's fine, Oscar said gently. Let her feel it. Dreaming's half the battle. Mira frowned, arms folding tighter across her chest. Dreams don't mean anything on this planet. Oscar didn't argue. He just began laying out the parts beside Zara, showing her each one, naming them, explaining how they worked in simple terms, watching as her eyes grew wider and wider. She understands more than you think, Mira said quietly after a long silence. Oscar glanced at her. I don't doubt it. Mira crouched down beside Zara then, brushing dirt from her daughter's cheek with a tenderness that didn't match the steel in her voice. She was born during a dust storm, she said softly. Took her first breath choking on metal in the air. That's what this world gave her. Oscar watched them both. And still she smiles. Because she doesn't know anything else, Mira replied, her gaze lifted, piercing. But you do. So what's your excuse? Oscar hesitated. For a long time he didn't answer, but something about the weight of her voice, the way it wasn't accusing, just tired, pulled words from places he usually kept locked up. There was a time I thought I could fix everything, he said. With the right tools, the right plans. I designed neural links for high-performance prosthetics, back when I worked for a corp that could afford the best of everything. I had a daughter once. She fell. We were supposed to have tech that caught that kind of thing before it happened, but the budget cuts didn't include that feature in the consumer version. Mira's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the way she stood. Less like a guard, more like a listener. Oscar looked away, fingers curling around a stripped wire. She died, and I kept fixing machines instead of people because machines don't scream or cry when you fail them. Zara, oblivious to the tension between adults, handed him a bolt. This one's shiny. Can it be part of me? He smiled, blinking against the sting behind his eyes. Yeah, let's make it the core of your super speed leg, huh? Mira's voice came quieter now. Why are you really here, Oscar? I don't know, he admitted. Maybe because she reminds me what it looks like to want something impossible and believe in it anyway. For a long moment, there was only the sound of wind and Zara humming again as she played with the parts. Then Mira spoke softly. We don't have power here, nothing stable. You'll have to charge anything you build off old panels or find a working cell. If it shorts, it could kill her. I'll make sure it doesn't, he said. Mira nodded once, a slow, reluctant nod, but not refusal. And in a place like Garrod 3, that was almost an invitation. As the sun finally climbed above the wreckage-stained horizon, Oscar sat cross-legged on the ground beside the girl, beginning to sketch rough designs into the dirt with a piece of scrap metal. Zara leaned close, eyes wide with wonder. Will it make noise when I walk? She asked. Like thump-thump? Probably, he said with a grin. Good. I want them to hear me coming. Oscar glanced up at Mira again. She hadn't moved, but she wasn't watching with suspicion anymore. She was watching her daughter, with something like hope, for the first time maybe in years. And in the quiet moments between blueprints drawn in dirt and rust, Oscar realized something dangerous. He wasn't planning to leave anymore. The smell of scorched protein wafers drifted through the twisted corridors of scrap. It was faint, but warm, like something half-remembered from better days. Oscar crouched over a compact cook unit fashioned from the heating coils of a derelict shuttle. He'd salvaged it just the day before, cleaned it, reinforced it, and now it sat humming beside the shelter like it belonged there. Smells funny, Zara said, peeking around the corner, her white bob catching the light of the flames. It's not fancy, Oscar replied, flipping the slabs with a piece of bent sheet metal. But it's food, real protein, grown in a vat, probably older than I'd like to admit, but your stomach won't know the difference. Zara giggled, crawling closer. She wore her prosthetics again today, still shaky but improving. Every time she stumbled, she laughed. Every time she stood taller. Mira watched from the entrance of the shelter, arms folded, eyes sharp but no longer cold. Her long white hair was braided today, tied back with a bit of copper wiring. She hadn't said much since Zara first stood the night before, but her silence wasn't icy like before. It was thoughtful, waiting, watching. Oscar looked up at her. You eat yet? We're fine, she said. He arched a brow. You're proud, Mira. I get that. But proud doesn't feed your daughter. She didn't respond. Zara tugged at her mother's sleeve. Can we try it, Mama? It smells like burnt space station. Oscar laughed. Mira's lips twitched, almost a smile. Come on, he said, gesturing to the stones he'd arranged in a half circle. No strings, just dinner. Eventually, Mira came forward and sat down slowly beside Zara. The child nestled against her, legs stretching out stiffly in the braces. Mira watched her daughter's face, then looked at the food, skeptical but silent. Oscar served them using a bit of flat alloy he'd scrubbed clean. The protein wafers were crisp at the edges, soft in the middle, infused with basic nutrients and a little salt. He handed the first plate to Zara, who sniffed it like a curious animal. She took a bite. Her eyes widened. "It tastes like chewy stars," she declared. "That's a compliment, I hope." Zara nodded furiously. "Chewy, salty stars." Mira tasted hers more cautiously. After a pause, she gave a soft exhale, almost a sigh. "I forgot how warm food feels in the chest," she murmured, barely audible. Oscar didn't say anything. He handed her a small flask of filtered water and then pulled a slim, black-wrapped bar from his coat pocket. He unwrapped it and broke off a square. "I was saving this," he said, "but I think it'll do more good here." Zara's eyes lit up. "What is it?" "Chocolate," Oscar said. "Earth food." She reached for it eagerly. Mira instinctively moved to stop her, but Oscar held up a hand. "It's safe, sweet, bit strong, but you'll like it." Zara popped it into her mouth and immediately froze. Her eyes went wide. She made a small, surprised noise, then slapped her hands over her mouth, chewing with comical exaggeration. When she swallowed, she stared at Oscar like he'd just handed her a miracle. "That," she whispered, "tastes like dreams." Oscar grinned. "I thought it might." She looked at her mother. "Mama, did you ever taste a dream?" Mira reached out, gently brushing a crumb from her daughter's cheek. "Not like that?" Zara offered the second piece. "You should." Mira hesitated, then took it. She didn't react much, but when she looked back at Oscar, her eyes were softer, quieter. "You shouldn't give things like that away," she said. "It's just chocolate," he replied. "No," she said, her voice low. "It's something we didn't think we'd ever have again." Oscar didn't argue. After they ate, Zara leaned against her mother and yawned, eyes drooping. Her body was small and fragile, but her spirit burned so bright it made Oscar ache. Mira cradled her, humming something under her breath, a tune that sounded like starlight and old sorrow. Oscar sat back on his heels, letting the silence settle. The wind rustled through the piles of scrap and metal, carrying the distant clatter of something shifting deep in the yard. "I still don't get it," Mira said after a long pause. "Get what?" "Why you're here." Oscar glanced down, fingers running over a piece of twisted wire. "I told you. I needed to be needed." "That's a noble excuse. But people like you don't stay. You help. You fix. Then you leave before the rust starts to cling." Oscar looked at her, and this time there was no sarcasm in his tone. "Maybe I'm tired of leaving." Mira held his gaze. Her eyes were the color of deep sea algae, glowing faintly in the low light. She didn't blink. "You say that now," she said. "But you don't know what this place does to people." He nodded. "Maybe. But I've been in worse places, and none of them had someone like her." Mira looked down at Zara, sleeping soundly in her lap. "I was born in a sky city," she said quietly, unexpected. "Tall glass towers, clean air, 1,000 lights blinking like stars. I was supposed to inherit my mother's post, water steward for our district. I was trained, educated, promised a future." Oscar didn't move. He let her speak. "Then I fell in love with someone from the ground, an outsider. He told me he wanted to take me somewhere new, start over, build something together. I followed him. We landed here." She paused. 2 weeks later, he was gone. Stole our last working generator and left me 6 weeks pregnant. Oscar's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "I've been alone ever since, fighting to keep her warm, federal, alive." "You did more than that," Oscar said. "You raised someone who still believes in running." Mira didn't reply right away. When she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "She's the only reason I didn't let the rust take me." Oscar leaned forward, voice quiet. "She's lucky. She has you." Their eyes met. This time, neither of them looked away. For a brief moment, the world around them, the junk, the cold, the forgotten air, faded. All that remained was the fire between them and the weight of two lives, broken in different ways, but somehow fitting together in the cracks. "You really going to stay?" Mira asked. Oscar didn't smile. And in the dim light, but she didn't argue either. The wind had a different tone tonight. It wasn't the usual whispering breath that danced between the bones of the junkyard. It howled, long, guttural, sharp, like it knew something was coming. Oscar sat outside the shelter beneath a makeshift awning, hunched over a workbench cobbled together from scrap panels and stabilizer legs. Sparks sputtered from the neural node he was soldering. The glow reflected in his eyes, but his mind was elsewhere, far from circuitry, far from wires. He wasn't looking at the work anymore. His eyes were fixed on a memory only he could see. "I used to work for a company," he said suddenly, his voice low. "Viralon Systems. They specialized in augmentation interfaces, neurolinked enhancements, all sleek, expensive. People paid millions to walk better, run faster, be more." Mira, who had just stepped out to check the night, froze mid-step. "But there was always a catch," he continued, his voice now distant. "If you were rich, you got safety protocols, redundancies, smart response cores. If you weren't, you got the cheap version. You got what we gave you." He shifted like the words themselves were uncomfortable in his mouth. "My wife, Amira, was an emergency surgeon. Fierce, loud, smarter than everyone in the room and never let you forget it. She used to yell at me while making breakfast, then turn around and kiss my neck while pouring my coffee. She hated the company, hated what I helped build." Mira didn't speak, but she moved a little closer. Oscar's gaze never left the dark horizon. "She said we sold hope, but only to the people who could afford to buy it back when it failed." He smiled, bitter and fragile. "We had a daughter, Alara. She was 5. Bright as her name, she made up her own languages, called wires tickle snakes and batteries crunchy coins. She used to sit on my lap while I coded. She didn't care how anything worked. She just wanted to build something that could fly." The silence between them deepened. "She died falling from a school balcony. It was 3 stories, not high. Shouldn't have been fatal, but the tech we had, impact sensors, fall dampeners, those were in the prototypes, not in the consumer version." His voice cracked slightly. "They cut the feature 6 months before. Said it wasn't cost-effective. Quiet decision. No press release. Just gone." He took a breath and let it out slowly. "She hit the ground and never woke up." Mira didn't look away. Her arms were folded now, tight across her chest, not out of judgment, but because she understood what it meant to hold something in too long. "I spent 3 weeks in our apartment," Oscar said. "I couldn't walk past her room. I kept her bracelet in my pocket. Still do." He tapped his coat. "Amira couldn't stay. She didn't leave angry. Just empty. She said the walls screamed. Said she had to go before she forgot how to breathe." He glanced toward the shelter, toward the sound of soft breathing coming from inside. "I didn't blame her." He looked at Mira now. Really looked. "I stopped designing after that. Started drifting. Station to station. Salvaging parts from corpses of dreams. It was easier when the only things I fixed couldn't die." He looked down at his hands. "But when I saw Zara crawling through dirt with blood on her knees, whispering about running," his voice trembled. "I saw Ilara, not her face, not her voice. Just the same fire. The same belief that she could fly." He swallowed hard. "I couldn't walk away again." Mira said nothing for a long time. "Then, you stayed." "I did." And then, without warning, the wind changed again. Oscar stiffened. So did Mira. Underneath the wind, now came the low, pulsing drone of an engine, throaty, predatory. The whine of hovercraft turbines, approaching fast. Oscar stood, his body tensing as if someone had pulled a string in his spine. Mira's eyes narrowed. "You hear that?" she asked. He nodded. "Sector raiders? Or worse?" Oscar scanned the wreckage. 50 meters west," he said quickly. "Collapsed cryopod casing, shielded. Hard to scan." Mira's jaw tightened. "I'm not leaving her." "You're not," he said calmly. "I'll take her, you stay here. Guard the entrance. If they find nothing, they'll move on." Mira hesitated just a second. Then she disappeared into the shelter and re-emerged, Zara, already wrapped in a thick cloth, barely awake and blinking against the cold. "Mom?" she whispered, frightened. "It's all right, little star," Mira whispered, crouching beside her. "Remember our game?" "Hide and glow," Zara said, nodding. Oscar held out his arms. Mira didn't move at first. Then, eyes filled with silent fury and fragile trust, she passed her daughter to him. Oscar didn't wait. He moved like a shadow, quick, low, weaving between scrap towers and collapsed freighters, hugging darkness as if it were armor. Zara trembled in his arms. He whispered softly, "You're doing perfect. Just a bit further. You're a ghost now, Zara, quiet as a starbeam." They reached the pod. Oscar pried it open, slipped inside and closed the lid. Darkness swallowed them. Above, engines roared. Voices, flashlights, the hiss of a plasma torch. Zara clung to him, face buried in his chest. "You're safe," he whispered, over and over. "I've got you." Eventually the sounds faded. The rig powered up. The raiders moved on. Oscar lifted the lid. Night air rushed in. He smiled down at her. "We won." Zara blinked up at him. "We shined small." Back at the shelter, Mira stood amid the destruction. Raiders had ripped through everything. Her jaw was set, knife still in hand. Then she saw Oscar, Zara safe in his arms. Her expression cracked, not with tears but with something else. Relief laced with disbelief. "She's all right," he said simply. Mira took her daughter. Zara pressed her face to her mother's shoulder. "He hid me in the stars," she mumbled, already falling asleep again. That night they sat around the fire, silent, closer than they'd ever been. After Zara had drifted into sleep, Mira finally spoke. "I lost someone in a raid like that," she said. Oscar turned. "My brother. They came for our fuel. We had none left. He told me to run. I ran." Her voice thinned. "Zara was born 3 months later." Oscar said nothing, just nodded. "You kept her alive," he said eventually. "That matters." Mira looked at him. "She's the only thing that does." Silence stretched between them, then soft as a confession. "Thank you, for tonight." Oscar met her gaze. "I'd do it again." She nodded once. That was all. When he stood to retreat into his corner, she didn't stop him, but her voice followed him. "Maybe it's time to stop surviving." Oscar paused. He didn't look back, but he didn't go far. That night, Mira fell asleep with Zara wrapped in her arms and didn't wake with fear clawing at her chest. Just a question whispered into her own dreams. What if we're not broken anymore? The junkyard didn't sleep, but it could grow quiet, eerily so. After the raid, Garrett 3 fell into one of those long silences, as though the metal graveyard was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. The air still carried the faint chemical bite of scorched fuel and oxidized circuitry, but it no longer threatened. It merely lingered, like a warning. Oscar stood at the edge of their shelter, hands on his hips, eyes scanning the horizon. The scavenger gang was gone. Their repulsor trails faded, but he knew better than to trust a moment's peace out here. Trouble rarely knocked twice in the same way, but it always found its way back eventually. Behind him, inside the low, curved walls of their makeshift home, Zara slept soundly beneath a patchwork blanket. Mira sat nearby, legs crossed, quietly sharpening the edge of a broken blade. Not for violence, just habit. Something in her hands to keep her anchored, to keep the fear from creeping too deep. Oscar's attention returned to the pieces spread out across the work table he'd scavenged from a downed escape pod. The prosthetic legs, his creation, his promise to Zara, lay in front of him like the pieces of a puzzle still refusing to fit. Wires coiled like vines across the table's surface. Servos lay half exposed, circuits exposed like nerves beneath skin. They were almost ready, but not enough. The raid had damaged more than he'd realized. A support joint had seized mid-stride. A thermal sensor had shorted out. The gyroscope he'd carefully calibrated had fractured during their sprint to the cryopod. Zara didn't complain. She only smiled and said, "It's okay, I can wait. But I won't wait forever, Fixerman." Oscar had chuckled at that. But now, as he stared down at his broken design, he didn't feel like laughing. He needed more, stronger parts, lighter metal. Something that wouldn't fail, not when she was trusting it with her dreams. A soft voice stirred him from his thoughts. "You're grinding your teeth again." He turned. Mira stood behind him, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "That usually means frustration, or guilt," he sighed. "Maybe both." "She doesn't blame you," Mira said. "Neither do I." Oscar glanced at the leg components. "That's the problem, I do." There was a silence between them, not cold, just full. Then Mira stepped closer. "What do you need?" Oscar blinked. "What?" "To finish them," she said. "What do you need?" He looked at her, unsure if this was a test or something else. "Hyperflex alloy for the thigh brace, a dual balance stabilizer, and something I haven't figured out yet, something to make them more than just legs." Movement without fear, Mira murmured. He nodded. Exactly. She stared at him for a moment, then turned and picked up her blade. I know where we might find something. West Ridge. There's an old mech drop site, pre-collapse era, heavy military tech. Scanners barely work there. You've been there? She smirked. Not alone, and not recently, but we'll go tomorrow, together. Oscar raised an eyebrow. You're volunteering to scavenge with me? I'm volunteering to build legs that won't break under my daughter. His chest tightened a little at that, but he nodded. That night, while Zara slept and the junkyard wind whispered through holes in the siding, Oscar sat beside his tools, sketching a new design by firelight. Mira sat across from him, polishing the curved brace they'd salvaged that morning. The crackle of the fire was the only sound, but it was a comfortable silence. At one point, their hands met over the same bolt. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. The next morning, they moved early. Mira led the way through a maze of collapsed cargo ships and rust-choked service tunnels. Her steps were quick, precise, but she always paused to let Oscar catch up. She didn't talk much. He didn't press her. Eventually, they reached the drop site, a half-buried husk of a combat walker surrounded by twisted steel and cracked power cores. The air shimmered faintly with residual charge. It felt like stepping into the bones of a long-dead beast. This is where my brother died, Mira said softly. Oscar stopped beside her. I'm sorry. She didn't respond immediately. We came here to strip a guidance system. He triggered a dormant AI node. It turned on him. We were too poor to afford proper training, too desperate not to try. Oscar wanted to reach for her shoulder. He didn't. She didn't need comfort. She needed this said aloud. I never came back here, until now. She stepped forward and knelt beside the broken remains of the walker. Oscar joined her, gently pulling loose the servo clamps and optic cores. Beneath a burned panel, he found a dual-joint stabilizer, still intact, shielded by chance or fate. They didn't speak again until they'd returned to the shelter, hours later, sunburned and scraped, but carrying what they needed. For the next 3 days, Oscar worked. Mira was beside him constantly, not just helping, learning. She picked up faster than he expected, adapting his tools to her grip, asking sharp, efficient questions. By the second day, she'd rewired an entire limb assembly herself. At night, Zara watched them from her bedding, drawing symbols on the dusty floor with a bit of chalk. This is what my legs will feel like, she said one night. This line is fast. This one is brave. Oscar smiled. What about this one? He asked, pointing to a zigzag. That one's funny, Zara said, laughing. In case I trip. He couldn't stop smiling for hours. On the fourth night, Oscar completed the final neural link. It hummed softly in his hand, a pulse of light, almost like a heartbeat. He turned to Mira. She was watching him, not the device. We're ready, he said. She nodded but didn't speak. That night, as Zara slept nearby, Oscar and Mira shared a quiet meal, dried fruit, salvaged root bread, and warm silence. Mira reached across the table and touched his wrist, just barely. You gave her something she was never supposed to have, she said. Oscar looked at her, eyes searching. So did you, he said. You gave her fire. Their hands remained there, connected, not tightly, but purposefully. Neither said anything else. The forge was ready. The girl was ready. Now all that remained was the first step, and the belief that this time, it wouldn't break. Morning arrived gently, as if Garad 3 itself didn't want to disturb what was coming. Pale light filtered through the cracks in the shelter's patched ceiling, brushing against the wall like a hand searching in the dark. Outside, the junkyard was still for once, almost reverent in its silence. No wind, no engines, just the hum of anticipation, like the world knew it was about to witness something sacred. Inside, Zara sat upright, legs stretched out in front of her, her little blue hands resting on the alloy thigh guards of her new prosthetics. The limbs gleamed softly in the light, patched together from 100 forgotten machines, but shaped with care and precision. Her fingers traced the surface slowly, as if memorizing it by touch. Every servo had been tuned, every wire locked in place. This time, it was real. Are you ready? Oscar asked softly. She didn't look up, just nodded, her silver eyes wide and glowing. Mira stood behind her, silent, her arms folded not out of coldness, but to stop them from trembling. Oscar knelt beside the girl, ran a quick diagnostic, then pressed a thin interface key into the slot at her hip. The legs responded with a low, harmonious whir. Stabilizers clicked into readiness. A soft green light pulsed once beneath the knee joints. Zara looked down at them, blinking, then slowly turned her head toward her mother. "I want to try walking to her," she whispered. Oscar froze. He looked up at Mira, whose expression flickered, surprise, then something deeper. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Oscar stepped back. "It's your moment." He moved out of the way. Zara shifted her hands onto the floor, pushing upward, her body wobbling as she found balance. The braces whirred quietly beneath her, the gyros correcting her lean in real time. For a second, she stood still, taller than she'd ever been, looking straight into her mother's eyes. Mira didn't speak. She didn't move. Zara took a breath and stepped forward. The motion was small, a shuffle, but it was hers. Then another step, smoother, stronger. Her arms lifted for balance, awkward and bird-like. Her face lit up with sudden wonder, as if the ground had risen to meet her instead of the other way around. She walked. She walked toward her mother. Her smile grew impossibly wide, a burst of light breaking through the grime of the world. Her eyes shimmered, her whole body humming with uncontainable joy. And with every trembling step, that joy grew louder, until it exploded from her lips in a shout, "I'm walking!" Her voice cracked with laughter, raw, uncontrollable, beautiful. She was crying too, though she didn't seem to notice. "Mama, look what I can do!" Mira's hands covered her mouth, her eyes flooded, spilling silently down her cheeks. She didn't move, not yet. She couldn't. Her knees had gone weak. Zara reached her. She launched into her mother's arms with all the force her tiny frame could muster. The impact nearly knocked Mira off balance, but she held her as if she might vanish. Oscar stood nearby, hands still at his sides, chest rising and falling in quiet awe. He'd imagined this moment, built it in his mind 1,000 times, but nothing could have prepared him for what it felt like. Zara turned slightly in her mother's arms, her face radiant. "I did it! I walked! I walked to you, Mama!" "You did," Mira whispered. Her voice cracked. "Oh, stars, you did!" Then she looked at Oscar, her eyes already brimming, locked onto his, and something inside her cracked. She held Zara tightly for another moment, then gently handed her to the bedding and walked the short distance to where Oscar stood. And there, without a word, she pressed her face into his shoulder and began to sob, not in shame, not in weakness, in release. Years of holding it all in, years of being strong for someone else, of surviving, shielding, fighting alone. It all came undone in that moment, unraveling like thread in the seams of her heart. Oscar froze for just a second, startled by the intimacy of it. Then he wrapped his arms around her. One hand came up to the back of her head, the other to her waist. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Mira's tears soaked into the worn fabric of his coat. Her body trembled against him. But for the first time since he'd met her, she allowed herself to lean, not out of necessity, but because she wanted to. Zara watched from the bedding, quiet now, her eyes wide and soft. She smiled. Oscar tilted his head, his cheek brushing against Mira's temple. And slowly, gently, she looked up at him, eyes wet, cheeks flushed, soul unguarded. He hesitated, but when she didn't pull away, when her breath stilled and her gaze lingered on his mouth, he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't planned. It was soft, barely a breath, like two people who had forgotten what tenderness felt like. The kiss carried no promises, only truth. When they pulled apart, Mira didn't step back. She rested her forehead against his, eyes closed, hands still holding the front of his shirt. "You stayed," she whispered. "I meant to," he said. "I didn't think I could feel this again." He smiled. "Neither did I." A long silence fell between them, quiet, golden, fragile. Then Zara's voice cut through it, bright and proud. "Mama, I think I want to try running next." Mira let out a breath that turned into a laugh, full, real, and utterly alive. Oscar looked toward the girl and smiled. "Let's not rush perfection." Zara grinned. "But I'm not afraid of falling anymore." Mira turned to her daughter, her hands still entwined in Oscar's. "You never were." Outside, the wind picked up again, whispering through the wreckage. But for the first time, it didn't sound like loneliness. It sounded like a song, a quiet celebration. And in that rust-choked graveyard of a world, Something small, tender, and eternal had begun to bloom. Begun. The wind over Garrod 3 had changed. It still blew through broken hulls and tangled towers of forgotten metal, still sang across shattered plating and sun-bleached cables, but it no longer howled like a wounded thing. Now it whispered like a goodbye. Oscar stood at the edge of the junk field, wiping dust from his hands as the rising sun painted the sky in rust and gold. His old shuttle, patched, weathered, but fully functional, rested behind him, her engine ports glinting faintly in the morning light. He'd spent weeks repairing her in secret, careful not to raise false hope before he knew he could finish. And now, she was ready. The last engine check blinked green. The fuel cells were full. The system's nav beacon had locked onto coordinates he'd stared at for nights on end. Callan 6, a green colony nestled in a forgotten arm of the habitus loop. A world where the air was clean, the water drinkable, the land unscarred. A world where Zara could run without slicing her feet open on scrap. Where Mira could sleep without one eye open. Where they could all begin again. He turned at the sound of approaching footsteps. Mira walked toward him across the dust-swept ground, her long white hair pulled back loosely. Her movements were slower this morning, not tired but thoughtful. At her side, Zara trailed behind, her prosthetics clicking softly, balanced now by perfect calibration. Oscar gave them a small smile. She's ready. Zara stopped beside him and stared up at the ship. Her eyes went wide. It's beautiful, she breathed. Oscar chuckled. She's old and stubborn, but she flies. Like me, Zara said proudly, stretching out one leg and flexing the joint. Mira stopped a few paces behind, arms folded lightly, gaze locked on the shuttle. She didn't say anything right away. Oscar stepped toward her, his voice quieter now. We don't have to go far, just far enough. Mira looked at him, then back at the junkyard stretching out behind them, an ocean of rusted bones and memories she'd never asked for. I didn't think we'd ever leave this place, she said. You're not just leaving it, Oscar replied. You're choosing something better. She was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded. Not quick, not dramatic, just certain. Zara let out a whoop of excitement and darted back toward the shelter. I have to say goodbye, she called. Oscar frowned. To what? To the robot leg I drew a smiley face on, and the pipe I pretended was a sword, and the hole I hid in that one time. Mira smiled. She remembers everything. She's her mother's daughter. They watched her vanish around the corner. Then Mira turned back to Oscar. I used to think, she said, that if I stayed here long enough, I'd become strong enough to survive anything. Oscar tilted his head. And now? Now I think strength isn't about staying. It's about knowing when to stop surviving and start living. There was a pause between them. A moment weighted with meaning, years of grief, weeks of healing, and now this, the breath before a new life. Oscar stepped closer. His hand found hers with instinct, not hesitation. I'm glad you're coming. Mira looked up at him, eyes soft but steady. I'm glad you asked. They stood like that until Zara returned, her small arms stuffed with a bundle of wires, beads, and a dented gear she called Mr. Clicky. I'm bringing these, she announced. Of course you are, Oscar said with a grin. They boarded the ship slowly, not out of fear, but reverence. Inside, the air was clean, filtered, just slightly warm from the ignition cycles. The lights flickered to life as Oscar powered the main systems. He showed Zara how to buckle herself in, then walked toward the pilot's chair. Mira took the co-pilot seat without being asked. The engines rumbled to life. Through the viewport, Garrod 3 shimmered beneath them, gold and gray and endless. A graveyard, a cradle, a place of endings and beginnings. Zara pressed her hand to the glass. It looks smaller from here. It always does, Oscar said. The shuttle lifted, not fast, not loud, just steady. As they breached the upper atmosphere, the junk field fell away, the clouds breaking open like a curtain, revealing the stars beyond. The moment the ship entered space, Zara squealed. We're flying! I'm flying! Mira laughed. Oscar stole a glance at her and saw something in her face he hadn't seen before. Peace. They drifted in silence for a while, the stars wheeling slowly past. Oscar input the jump coordinates, then turned to Mira. I'll have to make some repairs when we land. She's not built for smooth rides. She doesn't have to be, Mira said. She just has to get us there. Zara unbuckled and climbed into her mother's lap. Mira welcomed her without hesitation, cradling her in her arms. Oscar watched them both, heart full and still. You gave her legs, Mira said softly. You gave her a reason to use them. She would have found one anyway. Oscar smiled. Maybe, but now she doesn't have to find it alone. The moment lingered, warm and weightless. Then slowly, Mira reached over and touched Oscar's face, a gentle brush of her fingers across his cheek. I used to think love was a luxury, she said, something people like us didn't get to have. Oscar turned his face into her hand. And now? Now I think it was just waiting for the right kind of broken. He leaned forward and kissed her again, this time not in sorrow, not in aftermath, but in light. Zara made a face. You, grown-ups are weird. They laughed, all three of them. When the jump sequence began to count down, Oscar took Mira's hand again. 5. The engines flared. 4. Mira kissed Zara's forehead. 3. Zara held tight to Mr. Clicky and smiled like the stars were hers. 2. Oscar looked ahead, past the rust and the silence and the ghosts. 1. And then they were gone. Off Garrett 3, into something new, into something alive. The air on Callan 13 smelled of earth. Fresh, loamy, sun-kissed earth. Not chemicals, not heat-seared metal, not burnt ozone or scorched dust, but real ground. Soil that grew things. Trees that whispered instead of groaned. Grass that curled between toes like tiny green ribbons. It had rained the night before, and now the colony shimmered with soft moisture. Dew clung to flower petals and solar panels alike, and in the distance, birds, real birds, sang out in short, crystalline notes. The sun had just begun to stretch over the horizon, casting long golden streaks across the open fields and the gleaming white buildings nestled into the slope of a hill. And in the middle of it all, like a comet streaking across a young sky, Zara ran, not stumbled, not practiced. She ran. Her prosthetic legs, newly upgraded by Oscar and a colony tech named Dala, moved beneath her like they were born of her spirit, not steel. They shimmered faintly with blue tracers as she dashed across the soft, springy grass, kicking up little clumps of dirt and laughter behind her. "Mama, look!" she cried out. "I'm so fast, even the wind's chasing me!" Mira stood on the porch of their new home, a modest, sunlit structure of white polyglass and wood-grown composite, wrapped in flowering vines that bloomed overnight thanks to Callan 13's engineered soil. Her long white hair drifted in the breeze. She was barefoot, smiling. "I see you, little star," she called back. Zara twirled mid-stride, arms outstretched, a blur of silver and blue, her laughter echoing across the meadow like music. A few colony children watched from a distance, stunned. Some clapped, others stared wide-eyed. Zara didn't notice. She was too alive. She slowed near the edge of the garden, turning, breathing hard, her cheeks flushed deep blue. Oscar approached from the side, wiping his hands on a rag. He'd been installing a water recycler that morning, something simple but satisfying. He wore loose fabric pants and a sleeveless work shirt, his skin tanned darker than it had ever been on Garrett 3. There was no oil on his face today, just sun and peace, and the soft creases of someone learning how to smile more often. Zara spotted him and sprinted over, nearly tripping over her own excitement. She didn't stop. She barreled into him, arms flung around his waist. Oscar caught her with ease, his breath leaving in a surprised laugh as he stumbled back a step. "Whoa! Careful there, turbo legs!" Zara giggled against his chest, then pulled back just enough to look up at him. Her silver eyes gleamed in the morning light. There was something in her expression, something different, focused, certain. "Oscar," she said quietly. He looked down. "Yeah?" She hesitated, just for a second. Then, breathless and trembling in the way only truth can make you tremble, she whispered, "Can I call you Dad now?" Oscar didn't move. The wind caught the edge of his shirt. A bird took flight nearby. The world tilted gently under the weight of a moment no one dared disturb. He crouched, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to call me anything you don't want to," he said carefully, voice low. "I want to," she replied immediately. "I've wanted to for a while. I just didn't know if you wanted to be." Oscar swallowed hard. "I've wanted that every day since I met you," he said. Zara's smile broke wide and radiant across her face. Then she flung her arms around his neck. "I love you, Dad." The words came out in one breathless, bright burst, like they'd been waiting in her chest for weeks. or years. Like she'd whispered them to herself in sleep, and now finally let them out into the light. Oscar's hands closed around her small frame, his forehead pressed to her temple, and for a long, aching second, he couldn't say a word. But Mira had stepped closer. She watched them from a few feet away, eyes shimmering. No fear, no hesitation, just love, wide open and wordless. Oscar finally looked at Zara again. "I love you too, Starlight," she grinned. "You do? With every wire, every bolt, every broken part of me that you helped fix." She pulled back and touched her prosthetics, legs slightly smudged from her sprint through the wet grass. "Do you think these will work forever?" Oscar shook his head. "Nothing works forever, but I'll be here to fix them every time." Zara looked over her shoulder toward Mira. "And Mama?" "She'll be there to catch you," he said, "like she always has." Mira walked over then, barefoot in the grass, and took Oscar's hand without asking. They stood together, three shadows merging into one under the rising sun. From the hill, the colony buzzed with soft, morning energy. Somewhere nearby, a bell rang for the morning market. A child shouted. A solar drone hovered low and quiet, spraying mist on a patch of fruit trees. The world didn't end. It didn't collapse. It didn't threaten or demand or break. It simply was. And in the middle of it, Zara ran again, her arms out like wings, prosthetic legs gleaming, laughter sharp and free. Not as someone trying to prove she could, not as someone chasing survival, but as a little girl, just being. Mira leaned her head on Oscar's shoulder. He turned and kissed her hair. "You ever think this would be real?" she asked. "I stopped dreaming," he admitted, "until she taught me how again." Zara's voice called from the field. "Hey, are you coming or what? I want to race both of you." Oscar smiled. "We're coming, Starlight," he said. "We're always coming." Then they walked into the morning light, hand in hand, toward the girl who had made the stars shine again.